If you're having a little trouble calculating excess, here's a problem that has units that maybe you're more familiar with. So I'm calling this a cookie stoichiometry problem. It says if you have 3 dozen eggs and 2 bags of flour, how many cookies can you make with the recipe below? And we've heard some examples like this in class, but now we're gonna actually do the dimensional analysis for it. So it says we have 3 dozen eggs and we have 2 bags of flour. Now, neither of those are the units that we have in the recipe. The recipe isn't in dozen eggs, it's in eggs, so we'll have to do a conversion there. And the recipe isn't in bags of flour, it's in cups of flour. So we're gonna have to do a conversion to get to the units of the recipe before we use it, but that's not a big deal, just a little dimensional analysis. And we have to do a limiting reactant problem because we have information about both of our ingredients. There are other ingredients, obviously, in making cookies. That's why I put ... there. But we're just going to focus on the eggs and the flour for right now. Let's assume we have enough of all our other ingredients. So we'll start with the eggs. We have 3 dozen eggs. Now, in order to use the ratio in our recipe, we're going to have to convert to eggs instead of dozen eggs. So we know that 1 dozen eggs is 12 eggs. And now we can use our recipe and say that we need 2 eggs to make 25 cookies. And if we go ahead and do the math here, this is going to get us 450 cookies. It's a lot of cookies. Okay, now let's take a look at the flour. We have 2 bags of flour. Okay, and for every 1 bag of flour, that's going to be 6 cups of flour. And now we can use our recipe because our recipe says for every 1 cup of flour, we're going to make 25 cookies. And we can do our math here and we get 300 cookies. Okay, so just looking at this really quickly, we follow the same steps we do in stoichiometry. We started with what we had. Now, we didn't go to moles, but we went to the units that the recipe's in. In chemistry, our reactions are the recipe, and they're in moles. Those coefficient means moles. So in this one, we had to convert to the units of the recipe, and then we used the recipe, or used the balanced reaction, and we didn't have to do the 4-step, go to what you want, because we had cookies, and that's what we wanted also. So we did the same steps, right? Start with what you have, go to the units of the recipe, use the recipe, and then go to what you want. Okay, next up, looking at our 2 answers, we know we can only make 300 cookies. We can't actually make 450 because we're gonna run out of flour. So our limiting reactant is flour, and our excess reactant, that's the eggs. Okay, so next up, we have to figure out how much of the excess reactant, in this case eggs, are used in this process. Well, we only made 300 cookies, so we're gonna start with that, and we're gonna say 300 cookies, and we're gonna figure out how many eggs that takes, right? So 25 cookies is 2 eggs. Now, we could stop there and figure out how many eggs, but our original unit was dozen of eggs, right? So if I want to compare how much I used up to how much I started with, I need to have the same unit. So I'm actually going to do one more step here and say for every 12 eggs, then that's a dozen eggs, because then I'll be able to compare it to the unit that I started with. In this case, we get that in order to make those 300 cookies, we're going to need 2 dozen eggs. So obviously less than we started with, because if we used all 3 dozen, we would have made 450 cookies. We didn't make 450 cookies, we only made 300. 300 cookies requires 2 dozen eggs. So then how much is left over? Well, we started with 3 dozen. And notice the units are the same, right? 3 dozen eggs minus 2 dozen eggs. We got some easier numbers here than we usually have in stoichiometry. And we're going to have 1 dozen eggs left over. So when we look back at this original reaction, we're going to have some of our eggs left over, So we're gonna have some eggs left over. In fact, a dozen of them left over. We're not gonna have any flour left. We're gonna use it all up in the process of making our 300 cookies.